Hello, all, and welcome back to Shatter Our Souls. Today, we are tackling the first episode of the collectathon, the end game artifact hunt, the one thing that acts as a blemish on almost every Metroid Prime in the entire franchise. And the thing I'm going to mention is that each game has always had its different approach, but how they approach it has always been with the mindset of what type of game it was in. Metroid Prime 1 was more about discovery. Prime 2 was more about fighting a war, off an enemy that was often unseen or unexpected. And Prime 3 is much more bombastic, energetic, and is more about the is more about the adventure. As a result of these three games having vastly different game feels, game approach, they end up having vastly different appeals to different groups, as a game should. Now, the thing with Prime 1's Artifact Hunt is that it was the initial one. Their whole idea for the hint system was effectively tell you the room it's in. If you've been everywhere in the world, then you were guaranteed to be able to find it. But that's pretty much as far as that hint system went. Prime 2 took the hint system and turned it into we'll call it a game of hide and seek. You're looking for Luminoth soldiers that have fallen in battle throughout the game as a whole, finding that same room in the Dark World to get your item, your key to the Sky Temple. But Prime 3 has the weirdest of the three. Now, I mentioned last time that there are, to my recollection, 9 keys. Each are labeled as power cells. These 9 power cells or batteries are used to power the GFS of Valhalla. This, of course, is meant to be a pseudo key, a system that allows the player to say, oh yeah, this is what I'm after, this is why. And it works, for the most part. Now, initially I said this was easily the weakest of the three, but it's partially because of what I personally see Metroid as. Metroid Primes 1, 2, and 3 have always been about the adventure. It's always been about the, I suppose, put bluntly, it has never been about combat focus. Prime 3, even with its more heavily combat focused narrative, still doesn't focus on combat in an exclusivity. And to look at that, I want to kind of point a finger at its compatriot or closest game that came out around the same time, which would have been Halo 3. Halo 3 and Prime 3 are two vastly different games, especially in how they approach game feel and their genre. Prime 3 said this is an action adventure. Yes, it is in the first person. Yes, it is a combat-based narrative, but it is not so combat-based to be a multiplayer shooter. And that was one of the things that Prime 3 was, in my mind, kind of noted for, was being a single-player adventure through and through. The goal was never about being the most powerful or the most dangerous soldier on the field. It was about finding the secrets of Phazon and trying to end the tyranny of none other than Dark Samus. It was about taking down your doppelganger, and in many ways, it was about an understanding of the universe as a whole and how it got to the circumstances that it did in the first two Prime games. This is all to say that Prime 3 had a very narrative-driven, but not so combat-focused narrative. Now, the reason I bring all of this up is because Halo, as a opposing force, is a very combat-driven game. The Master Chief and Arbiter are trying to end a war between the human and the Covenant, but in the same vein are also dealing with the Flood, a effective plague very similar in many ways to Phazon and Phazon corruption. They approach the problem in two very different ways for a reason. Prime 3 having the fewest power cells that are necessary to collect throughout the game has the fewest power cells to collect out of any artifact hunt. It has the most straightforward collectathon, as even in, I believe it was Zero Mission, Fusion, and even, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe even in Super Metroid, the map showed you in some capacity whether or not there were items to collect in an area. Prime 1 and 2 did not. Prime 3 has the wonderful system of allowing the player to fire off probes into the heavens to effectively allow Samus to get a glimpse of all the power-up locations in all, I guess it's now 5-ish planets, for a reason. This is part of what makes the game as unique as it is in its approach to the final hunt. Now, due to the fact that its final hunt has more of a combat focus, and it has all of the tools thrown at you, the reason I believe actually comes down to the genre and the style of gameplay that Prime 3 was aiming for. Prime 1 and 2, as I said, were very much adventure-based. They were much more about puzzle solving. They were much more about that slower, more methodical setup. But Prime 3 was much more bombastic. It's much more fast-paced. Each planet takes me about 2 to 3 hours to complete in the first pass of the story mode. And this is a good, I suppose, jumping off point to explain it. Because in Prime 1, the first major hurdle, I always say, comes in the form of the Parasite Queen. The second in the form of the parasitic plant Flagra. Or Flagra, depending on which version of the pronunciation you like. Point being, Flagra are an incredibly powerful foe that holds out one of the major upgrades of the game. You cannot progress much further than that battle without the Varia suit. This is important. But Prime 3 says, oh yeah, it's perfectly fine. We understand that there are limitations that we have to watch out for. But in general, each planet is relatively self-contained. What would take about 4 hours to get to, we'll say 4 hours to get to the end of Brio from the start of the game, you're looking at about an hour and a half to get to Flagra under a higher speed play. There is very little way to improve the speed of getting to Moganar on Brio, simply because of the more heavily combat focused and much more set-piece oriented gameplay of Prime 3. And this somewhat plays to its strengths and also plays into one of its greatest weaknesses. Now, I believe that I have, unfortunately, beat up Metroid Prime 3 a lot. And under no time and under no circumstances do I want people to feel as though I dislike this game. I enjoy it. I just also acknowledge that every game has flaws. Prime 3's greatest flaw comes in the form of its exploration, comes in the form of its more linear design, comes in the form of making a very bombastic, very stylized game, but with much more limited substance. And I have to say it in this way because I believe that Prime 3 is doing everything it can with what it was handled. See, there's a little... How do I want to put this? There's a ongoing discourse around what I'll call hand-holding. The idea that the devs don't necessarily trust their players to complete the game without them guiding the player through. And to a degree, I think that Prime 3 does struggle a little bit with hand-holding. It's not something that Retro is necessarily known for. And that's, I suppose, one of the first steps that we have to acknowledge here. Prime 3 is a very hand-holdy style game. The basis of that comes out of the fact that the accessibility of the Nintendo Wii made Prime 3 break some of the conventions of its own series in a way that was not necessarily a positive change, at least in my view. I see Prime 3's changes as necessary for the environment in which it was released, but I do not believe that it was necessarily the best course of action. In my mind, it would have been better to go with a more classically designed Metroid than to go with something that is more hand-holding. Because in doing so, it often felt as though it was alienating the core audience of the Metroid franchise through its design and through its hand-holding nature. But I keep saying that its design was alienating, and I say that it was ill-conceived. It wasn't planned out properly. And to that, I also have to say that it was planned out. It was thought through. Because Prime 3, and by extension, Prime 1, 2, etc., were all incredibly well put together. The main issue was not whether or not it was put together. The issue lied very directly in the fact that Prime 3 had to go with a different game feel. Now, game feel is a very weird subject, because if you're going to take a game and you're going to make it more action-packed, or more bombastic, more high-speed gameplay, then your players are going to often feel things like triumphant, they're going to feel empowered, they're going to feel like effectively a god, on a power trip, effectively. Prime 3 tries to give power trip and high octane, high energy, but its game feel is in contrast to other games of the franchise. If I were to compare every Metroid to one another in how it feels to play the game, Prime 1 would be more, for me, at this point in time, it feels more like a cozy game. It's one that I could pick up and play at any time because it's one that I played time and time again. I can, and in many cases, stop mid-gameplay to just stare at the butterflies fluttering around a tree. It's one of those things where the world itself feels fully realized, and yet there's an arcane beauty to Talon 4 as a whole. Prime 2 feels more desperate. And For me, I always felt that that desperation in Prime 2 made me much more task focused. I have to get to A to B to C to D as quickly as I possibly can to help the Luminoth before things get out of hand in this war. But the thing with Metroid Prime 2 is that if you sit back and really analyze the tools that you've been given, you'll realize that unless you, the player, fall in combat, Aether is looking to be in some pretty okay statuses, because there is nothing nothing allowing the Ing to attack the Luminoth much further, as the energy transfer module, which Samus holds right after the first boss of the game, is non-existent for the latter half of the game, or rather not touched on or even given a second chance for the latter half of the game. It shows up, it exists, and it disappears. And that desperate feeling comes, I think, partially through the game's art direction and design. The first 2 to 3 areas are incredibly war-torn. They're destroyed. There's so much decay of the environments that, for myself at least, I couldn't help but feel like I was never doing enough. Prime 3, you are dealing with these similar war-torn, damaged, battle-worn planets, but in a way that doesn't quite fit the same mold. Brio is in a state of decay after a major war, a civil war between its people. And this is all well and good. The civil war is something that the player is aware of very early on in Brio. And as you get more information, it becomes more of this question of why did Brio get to the circumstances it did? And so, as I'm going to say this kind of awkwardly here, every region has something more that it wants to tell, more that it wants to reach into that grab bag of tricks to showcase for the player. And that is something that Prime 3 does well. Its lore paints these various desperate or dying worlds in ways that make it seem like if Samus doesn't get involved, every single one of these planets is gone. Like I said, very bombastic, very high action kind of mindset. You, the player, are more likely than not going to rip through Metroid Prime 3 faster than almost any other game in the franchise. Well, you are going to attempt to rip through it faster than any other game in the Prime games because of its more narrative-driven, high-octane, high-speed, push you in the right direction kind of gameplay. Sure, there are locks, there are keys that you need to get to progress through each given locale, each given area. But by and large, the Prime 3 is heavily focused on an individual planet at any given time. There is very limited necessity for backtracking. There's very limited necessity for revisiting old areas until the endgame item hunt, where effectively you have nothing left to do. And this is kind of I suppose, another potential weakness of Prime 3. 1 and 2, 1 more specifically than 2, incentivize the player returning to an older area to item hunt on a regular basis, because every 3rd or 4th item was one that was from an area fairly old compared to where you're at. I can look at getting to Phendrana Drifts and the next expected item being the space jump boots, and having to traverse not just through Fendrana, but also through through part of Magmoor Caverns. Depending on the route you go, you either have to go through the Chozo Ruins, or you have to go through half of the Talon Overworld simply to get this next major upgrade. It's incentivizing the player to use what they have found to get upgrades and new tools along the way that the player might not necessarily need, but gives a sense of progression even when you're completely lost. Prime 3, when I got lost in the pirate hideout, or the pirate homeworld for hours on end as my first time playing through the game, I could not figure out what I was doing wrong. I went through those same loops endlessly trying to figure out where I'm supposed to go. And when it clicked fine, and I was able to progress fairly easily. But there was very limited incentive for me to leave the pirate homeworld in order to go back and actually collect more items. Because in my mind, the next item was just hidden somewhere just out of reach, out of sight for me. But, what do I know? I'm just a guy on a radio talking about a game. But while I've been talking about game feel tonight, I wanted to kind of touch in on why I believe game feel is so important for a game like Metroid. Every game in the franchise has a slightly different approach to game feel. Now, the trilogy made me feel empowered. It made me feel like my actions had impact. Like every action, reaction, every choice made a difference to the overall world of Metroid Prime 3. Every planet I traversed was another group saved. And that was great. But then you turn around and look at Zero Mission, the first 2D Metroid I ever finished. And don't judge me, it was at the time very hard to get 2D Metroids in general. But Zero Mission was the first one I got to. It took me 2 days to beat Zero Mission start to finish in my first playthrough, using some very interesting items to get sorted. But through it all, when I initially started playing through it, I felt very powerful very quickly. I felt like anywhere I needed to go, I could go. I felt like exploration and adventure were just par for the course. And with my prior experience with the Prime Trilogy, that just made sense. Explore the world, see what you can find. I never felt disheartened, I never felt weak. Whenever I found a new secret, it always felt like, oh, how do I get to that one? It was not disheartening. Next one I played through in the 2D franchise happened to be none other than Metroid 2. And I'll admit that one was supposed to make you feel triumphant, but also have a sense of foreboding. The world of Metroid 2 is a dying, desolate, decaying version of the planet SR-388. The planet itself, devastated by the Metroids that Samus is hunting, made for a very unique locale. One that, the further you went in, the more eerie, the more weird the planet seemed. The less life you could find, the less help there was possible, and the less likely that you, the player, or anyone for that matter, would be able to traverse the land, or, dare I say, survive in any encounter. Super Metroid had a very, I think, opposing. A lot of people feel very powerful and very triumphant when it comes to Super. I always felt disheartened, and partially because the gameplay did not match my expectations. It was too floaty. It made me feel weak. It made me feel slow, and made me question whether or not I was indeed good at Metroid games. I'm not. At least not the 2D games. Fusion made me terrified for most of the game because the entire point of it was that Samus, this character that you've now spent the last, in my case, 8 games worth of time with, is now at the all-time weakest she will ever be. She's lost her primary weapons, she's lost her greatest asset, she has lost her suit, and is being hunted by effectively an evil doppelganger. Something that Samus is getting really comfortable with at this point. But each portion of the game made me feel more terrified, more concerned for the well-being of not just Samus, but of the overarching universe of Metroid. And then we get to Dread, something that made me feel powerful. It was bombastic, it was fast-paced, but it also had moments where I felt genuine fear, like I needed to run and run now. Enemies that were impossible to defeat littered the game as the Emmys. And this is all intentional game design, and is why I will always say that Metroid, especially as a franchise, is and will always be one of the kings of game feel and game design in both a 2D and 3D space. But with this being said, planets Elysia and Norian are completed. Next time, we're heading to Brio. If you like what you see, drop a like, leave a subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Until then, be good to one another, and have a good one.